To this podcast, the Heidelcast.
It's a Heidel minicast. And now, Scott Clark.
Stemming another rising tide of theonomy.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
This is part one. By the way, if you'd like to know more about theonomy and a confessional critique of it and of Reconstructionism, go to heidelblog.net/theonomy. TheOnomy. heidelblog.net/theonomy. When the theonomic movement initially began to gain steam, Jimmy Carter, a Southern Baptist who had campaigned as a born-again Christian, was partway through his first and only term in the White House. 3 years before that, the Supreme Court of the United States had fabricated out of whole cloth a virtually limitless right to end the life of a baby in the womb. Born again was a new expression to a lot of Americans in the year that he took the White House in 1976 over a doomed Gerald Ford. No Republican was going to win the White House that year. Newsweek magazine had Carter on the cover with the words "Born Again" on October 2nd. And on October 25th, the cover was devoted to the born again phenomenon. It was the era of Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. America was back, baby. This was the context in which the theonomic movement coalesced around a single volume by Greg Bahnsen, who lived from 1948 to 1995. And the volume was Theonomy and Christian Ethics, published by Craig Press, which is really a subsidiary, I guess, of P&R Publishing, and that was in 1977. The broader Christian Reconstruction movement, led by R.J. Rushdoony, who lived from 1916 to 2001, had been around for a couple of decades already and had exercised a fair bit of influence in conservative religious and political circles. Rushdoony was a tireless advocate for homeschooling. And by the way, for all my disagreements with Rushdoony, and they are legion, he did us a lot of good in becoming a recognized expert in court, testifying on behalf of homeschoolers. So credit where credit is due. And Rushdoony gained a hearing in some surprising places in the 1970s and 80s. Still, Bahnsen's book, which advocated the future reimposition of the Mosaic judicial laws, went off like a bombshell, provoking reviews and responses in Christianity Today and even a volume of essays by the faculty of Westminster Seminary. His argument was shocking to the consciences of many American evangelical Christians for a variety of reasons. First, many American evangelicals had been reared in dispensational fundamentalism. As strict as they might have been in their own personal piety and personal morality, theologically and practically, many of them were antinomian. The Old Testament was thought generally to belong to previous dispensations in history, and thus, for them, not even the Ten Commandments were thought to be for today, as they like to say, let alone the Mosaic judicial laws. Second, among confessional Presbyterian and Reformed Christians, the ancient Christian distinction between the moral law, that is the Ten Commandments, and the ceremonial laws, that is the religious laws specific to the Israelites, and the judicial laws, that is the criminal and civil codes specific to the Israelites in the 613 commandments, as the rabbis counted them, was a given. It had been held for most of 2 millennia and endorsed and taught explicitly by all the magisterial Protestant reformers. To reject this distinction was a sign of Judaizing, that is, going backward in redemptive history. The Westminster Divines endorsed the distinction and its implication in Westminster Confession 19:4. And again, I quote, "To them also as a body politic," right, meaning as a political entity, "he gave sundry judicial laws, which expired together with the state of that people, not obliging any other now further than the general equity thereof may require. If you're not sure what general equity means, check out the episode I did a couple back where I went through the definition of general equity at some length. Also, check out the resources at heidelblog.net/theonomy, where I've got original source quotations defining general equity. But mainly, it just means natural law.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
So, Bahnsen argued for the abiding validity of the law of God in exhaustive detail. Specifically, however, what was at issue was the abiding validity of the Mosaic judicial laws, because no Orthodox Christian, historic Christian, confessional Protestant, or especially confessional Reformed Christian, denied the abiding validity of the moral law, and that would be antinomianism. And so that's what he intended by theonomy, is the abiding validity of the judicial laws. The term itself was made famous by the Bohemian process theologian Paul Tillich, who was JFK's sort of court theologian. He lived from 1886 to 1965. Used generically, it signified the superiority of the law of God over merely human laws. In this sense, theonomy was not in question among the confessional Protestants. The Westminster Seminary theologian and apologist Cornelius Van Til, who lived from 1895 to 1987, had also used it in the same generic sense, but he always disavowed the sense in which Bahnsen used it, right? The abiding validity of the judicial laws. Remember, Van Til was, after all, Dutch Reformed and raised with the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, and the Canons of Dort. He was, in short, a Dutch amillennialist, and no theonomist, no postmillennialist, no Christian Reconstructionist, however much he may have encouraged the movement in certain respects. The theonomy debate raged through the mid-1980s, at least, while I was in seminary at Westminster Seminary, California, from 1984 to 87. It was either in the background or the foreground of most debates. By the mid-90s, with Bahnsen's death, the momentum of the movement, as much as anyone can judge these things, seemed to ebb. In the first Trump administration, Roe v. Wade, along with Doe and Casey, was overturned, but in 2015, the Supreme Court imposed same-sex marriage on all 50 states, thereby repeating the mistakes of Roe, Doe, and Casey. And, at least for a time, it seemed like it was all but illegal to say publicly that males are one sex and females are another. I think that's changing, and that's a good thing. But the COVID regulations and the chaos that was a part of that crazy time and lockdowns and all that gave new stimulus to Christian Reconstructionism, theonomy, and Christian nationalism. Major mainstream media outlets began paying attention to the new headquarters of the theonomic movement in Moscow, Idaho, and paying attention to their plans of theonomic Reconstructionist church and their plan to Christianize Moscow and then from there the rest of the world.
Call or text now 760-618-1563.
A few years ago, Crawford Gribben published a full-length survey of the movement in Moscow, and I recommend this to you. The title is Survival and Resistance in Evangelical America, Christian Reconstruction in the Pacific Northwest, published by Oxford University Press in 2021. On the ground, their political candidates have not had much success in Moscow, but more broadly, the publishing house in Moscow seems to be doing gangbuster business, as are their videos and their school curricula, etc. Fundamentalist American Christians are frightened, and they've latched on to the religious equivalent of Donald Trump, that is, a fellow who fights against the bad guys out there. The most basic claim of the theonomic ethic is that the judicial laws have not expired with the state of that people, which is obviously a flat contradiction of the Westminster Divines, Westminster Confession. Further, apparently ignorant of the classical and traditional Christian usage of the term general equity, natural law, Bahnsen and others redefined it to mean, as I say, whatever Rushdoony, Gary North, Gary DeMar, or Bahnsen says it means. History hasn't been a strong suit of the theonomists, and neither has biblical theology. By that I mean progressive revelation and redemption, nor biblical exegesis. After all, this argument is really about the progress of revelation and redemption. Were these specifically Israelite laws temporary or not? With the Church Universal, the confessional Protestant traditions have said that they are. The first theonomist, as I've mentioned in a previous episode, of any note was a former Lutheran theologian turned, at least briefly, Anabaptist, Andreas Bodenstein von Karlstadt, who died in 1541. Several of the Anabaptists postulated a future earthly glory age when Christians shall have conquered all their enemies. Karlstadt theorized that in such a glory age, the Mosaic judicial laws would be reimposed. He was denounced as a Judaizer, and his views repudiated in the Augsburg Confession, 1530, Article 17, and in the Second Helvetic Confession from 1566 in Article 11. And if you've been listening to the Heidelcast, you've heard me read from the latter, but it's identical to what the Augsburg says. The Reformed biblical theologians recognized that the Mosaic theocratic state was intentionally temporary. They recognized that it was intended to point to the new covenant and to Christ. They recognized and repeatedly said that the judicial and religious laws were part and parcel of the types and shadows that had been fulfilled by Christ. So it's no surprise that Bahnsen's biblical exegesis in Theonomy and Christian Ethics is spectacularly unpersuasive. His interpretation of Matthew 5:17 through 20 has been dismantled more than once. Another passage that both he and his dispensationalist cousins, the hermeneutical similarities between the two movements is striking, and perhaps helps to explain the ease with which premillennial dispensationalists become theonomists, cannot explain plausibly Hebrews 7:11 through 14. And in the next episode, that's where we'll go.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
For this podcast, the Heidelcast.